I always thought the vastness of the desert would calm me. It's what I needed after everything that had happened at work. The constant pressure, the unrelenting deadlines, the suffocating feeling of being boxed into the same routine. I planned the trip to Big Bend National Park months ago, thinking a week away from it all would clear my head. Solitude in the desert seemed like the perfect way to hit the reset button. I'd heard the stories, of course. Rumors of spiritual significance, whispered legends passed down by native tribes. But I'd never put much stock in that kind of thing. They were just stories, right? I was wrong. Big Bend is a place where the land meets the sky in such a dramatic way that it's almost unnerving. The sun bakes the earth by day, and at night the stars stretch endlessly, a canopy of light over the barren landscape. The silence is definite, and out here, far away from everything, it feels like the world is holding its breath. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip behind the distant Chizos Mountains. My plan was simple. Hike the trail to the window, a spot famous for its breathtaking sunset views. I'd set up camp, spend the night there, and continue deeper into the wilderness the next day. A week alone, away from the noise of civilization. I'd been craving this. Everything seemed perfect at first. The air was dry and warm, the trail rugged but manageable, and my gear was top-notch, a mix of high-end camping equipment and essentials I'd collected over the years. I felt prepared, confident, ready to let the desert cleanse my mind. But that feeling didn't last. By the time I reached my campsite, I noticed my GPS was flickering, the signal coming and going without explanation. I chalked it up to a glitch. Maybe the battery was low, though I had checked it before I left. Then my phone started to act strange. The battery, which had been at 80% when I arrived, drained rapidly, dropping to 20% in just a few minutes. No big deal, I thought. I wasn't here to use my phone. After all, this was supposed to be my escape from technology. As I set up my tent, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the cold wind swept through the canyon. I hadn't expected the temperature to drop so quickly, and I fumbled through my pack for my jacket. My hands were shaking, and I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. That's when I heard it. The first sign that something wasn't right. It was faint at first, just a whisper carried on the wind, so soft I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, rhythmic, almost like chanting, echoing through the canyon. I paused, holding my breath, straining to hear. There was nothing. Just the sound of the wind. Get it together, Tyler, I muttered to myself. I was overthinking things again. The wind through the rocks, that's all it was. My mind playing tricks on me, feeding into my anxieties like it always did. I finished setting up camp and tried to relax, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. The silence was oppressive, heavy, as if the desert itself was waiting for something. I tried to brush it off. I was just tired, exhausted, really. That night, as I lay in my tent, the whispers returned, louder this time, clearer. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something real. The whispers grew, surrounding me, coming from every direction. They weren't in English, not even Spanish. It was an ancient language, guttural and rhythmic, like a chant I couldn't understand. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart racing. I reached for my flashlight, but when I clicked it on, the beam sputtered and died. My hands fumbled in the darkness, searching for my backup lantern. When I found it, I clicked it on, flooding the tent with light, but the whispers didn't stop. They only seemed to get closer. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't just anxiety. Something was out there. I stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face. The fire I'd built earlier had long since died down to embers. I looked around, scanning the landscape with my lantern. That's when I saw it. The small stone cairns, dozens of them, scattered around the edges of my campsite like tiny tombstones. They hadn't been there when I set up camp. I was sure of it. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here, or something. My mind raced. Could it have been other hikers? A prank, maybe? But the trail had been empty when I arrived, and this was an isolated spot. No one would have come this far just to mess with me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. My hands were shaking as I backed toward my tent, the beam of my lantern swinging wildly across the ground. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement. A shadow, just at the edge of the light, darting between the rocks. It was too fast to be human. My heart pounded in my chest as I swung the lantern around, trying to catch another glimpse. But there was nothing, just the empty desert. I bolted back into my tent, zipping it shut behind me, as if that thin layer of nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. I sat there, gripping the lantern, listening to the whispers fade into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise made my heart jump. Every gust of wind felt like something moving just outside. By morning, the whispers were gone, but the unease lingered. I packed up camp, deciding to cut my trip short. I'd head back to the trailhead, call it a failure, and go home. There was no shame in that. But as I started hiking back, something was off. The trail didn't look right. The landmarks, the rock formations, they weren't where they should have been. I pulled out my map, trying to orient myself, but nothing matched. It was like the land itself had shifted overnight. I checked my GPS, but the screen was blank, dead. My phone, too, had lost all power. Panic set in. I was lost, completely, utterly lost, in the middle of the desert. I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe. I could find my way back. I'd just retrace my steps. But no matter how far I walked, the landscape seemed to warp around me, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. My footprints, which should have been visible in the sand, were gone, erased, as if I'd never walked that way at all. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on me, but the cold from the night before hadn't left. It clung to me, seeping into my bones. And then I saw it again. The shadow. It was further away this time, just a dark figure standing on the ridge watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin. I couldn't make out any features, just its silhouette against the sky. It didn't move. It didn't come closer. It just stood there, watching. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get away from it. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I scrambled over the rocks, my pack bouncing against my back. But no matter how far I ran, the figure was always there, always just at the edge of my vision, standing still, waiting. My mind raced with the legends I'd read before the trip. Stories of Lala Hor, the evil hour, a spirit that lured travelers to their doom. It was said to appear just before tragedy struck, a warning of death. I hadn't believed in those stories, not really. But now, with the shadow stalking me, I wasn't so sure. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert. I was exhausted, my body aching, my mind frayed. I couldn't keep running. I had to face it. I stopped, turning to look at the ridge behind me. The shadow was closer now, standing still, its dark form blending with the rocks. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I'm not afraid," I said aloud, though my voice wavered. "I'm not afraid of you." The shadow didn't move, but I felt its presence, heavy and oppressive, weighing down on me. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stand my ground. Slowly, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the landscape like smoke. The whispers, too, faded into the wind, growing quieter until they were gone. I stood there for a long time, the desert silent once more. The sky darkened above me. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here any longer. The next morning, I found the trail. The landscape had returned to normal, the landmarks in the right places, as if nothing had changed. I made my way back to the trailhead, my legs weak, my mind still spinning from the encounter. I left Big Bend that day, never to return. Some people might say it was just my imagination, that the isolation and the anxiety had gotten to me. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The desert is a place of mystery, a place where the veil between worlds is thin, and sometimes something crosses over. I parked my RV deep in the Black Hills, farther than I'd ever dared to go before. The last sign of civilization had been a gas station over an hour back, and now it was just me, the trees, and the silence. And that was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. After the divorce, I craved it like a drug. I needed this trip to remind myself of who I used to be, before the arguments, before the failures, before the loneliness settled in like a slow-burning rod. Out here, surrounded by miles of forest, I'd find peace. At least that's what I told myself as I killed the engine, the sudden quiet swallowing me whole. I climbed out of the RV and stretched, breathing in the sharp cold air. The Black Hills were breathtaking. Tall, ancient pines rising like sentinels against the darkening sky. The wind was still, not even a rustle of leaves. Just silence. I walked around the clearing, feeling the weight of the world lift ever so slightly with each step. This was why I loved the wilderness, the isolation, the escape. But there was something off this time, a heaviness in the air. I'd been here before, years ago, but it had never felt like this. I shook off the feeling. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had been a rough few months, and I wasn't thinking straight. A couple of nights out here would fix that. I busied myself with setting up camp, though I didn't have much to do. The RV had everything I needed. I lit a fire outside anyway, for old time's sake, and poured myself a drink. I sat on the fold-out chair and stared into the flames, letting the warmth pull me in. Then I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like tapping. I looked around, but there was nothing. Probably just the forest settling. I turned back to the fire, trying to relax, but the noise came again, rhythmic, deliberate this time. I couldn't shake it off. Animals, I muttered to myself, standing up and shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense undergrowth. I scanned the edge of the forest, expecting to see a raccoon or a deer, but there was nothing. Just the trees, standing tall, unmoving. I took a deep breath and laughed. I was being paranoid. The first night alone always did this to me, made me jump at shadows. I headed back into the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I slept fitfully. Dreams of my ex-wife drifted through my mind, her face twisted in anger, her voice echoing in that same sharp, accusing tone I knew too well. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. By morning, the feeling of unease still clung to me like a damp fog. I tried to ignore it, pushing myself to enjoy the day. I spent the morning hiking, trying to lose myself in the familiar sights of the Black Hills, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt off, too quiet, too still. I returned to the RV just after midday, planning to settle in and enjoy a lazy afternoon. That's when the real problems began. The generator sputtered and died as I tried to start it up. I cursed, fiddling with the switch, but nothing happened. No power, no lights, and no heat. I wasn't worried yet. I couldn't figure it out. I always did, but the frustration simmered beneath the surface. I was already on edge, and the last thing I needed was for the RV to start malfunctioning. I grabbed my toolkit and went outside, working on the generator for what felt like hours. As I crouched next to the RV, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, wrench in hand, listening. There it was again, soft, slow steps, like someone was circling me. I whipped around, but the forest was empty, just the same dense pines, standing silent, watching. "Get it together, Jack," I muttered, turning back to the generator. By dusk, I was back inside. The generator was still dead, and the RV was cold, but I told myself it was fine. I'd built a fire outside, so I didn't need heat in here. I sat by the fire again, staring out into the forest, hoping the flames would chase away the anxiety that had been building all day. That's when I saw them. Shadows, just at the edge of the firelight. They were tall, thin, humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too elongated, too stiff. They stood between the trees, unmoving, watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but they didn't disappear. They were still there, standing in the shadows just beyond the fire. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. The figures remained still, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I stood up slowly, grabbing the flashlight and shining it toward them. But the beam seemed to bounce off the darkness, unable to penetrate the trees. When I lowered the light, they were gone. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I paced the small space, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone followed me out here? Were they messing with me? I grabbed my phone, only to find the battery drained, dead. The same with my watch. I was completely cut off. I tried to calm myself down, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. I felt like I was being watched, even inside the RV. I peeked out the window, expecting to see those figures again, but the clearing was empty. The fire outside was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the ground. I crawled into bed, wrapping myself in blankets to ward off the chill that had settled in. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was jumping at shadows because of the divorce, because of the loneliness. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I barely slept that night, and when I did, my dreams were filled with strange voices, whispers that sounded like my ex-wife, but hollow, distorted. She called to me from the darkness, telling me to come outside, to follow her into the trees. When I woke, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. It was morning, but the RV was still freezing. I could see my breath fogging in the air. I had to leave. Something was wrong here, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I threw my things together, ready to get the hell out of the Black Hills, but when I tried the engine, the RV wouldn't start. No matter how many times I turned the key, it sputtered and died. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, panic rising in my chest. I grabbed my bag and rushed outside, but as soon as I stepped into the clearing, I froze. They were back. The figures, tall, hollow-eyed shadows, stood at the tree line, surrounding the clearing. Dozens of them now, all watching me, waiting. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The fire had burned out during the night, and the clearing was shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog. I had to get out of here. The figures didn't move as I grabbed my camping knife and marched toward the nearest tree, determined to hack my way out of this nightmare. I had seen strange carvings on some of the trees, symbols, jagged and twisted. Maybe they had something to do with this, something to do with the figures. With trembling hands, I drove the blade into the bark, carving through the strange lines. As soon as I broke the symbol, the air shifted. The shadows flickered, and for a moment, I thought I heard a low echo and wail. I didn't stop. I hacked at the trees, cutting through every symbol I could find. The voices in my head grew louder with each slash. My ex-wife's voice, distorted and hollow, begged me to stop, telling me to come into the forest, to let go. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. Finally, when I had cut through the last symbol, the air went still. The figures at the tree line melted away, dissolving into the fog. I stumbled back to the RV, my legs weak, my mind spinning. The engine roared to life on the first try. I sped out of the clearing, not daring to look back. The Black Hills vanished behind me, swallowed by the fog. But even now, as I write this, I can still feel them watching, waiting. The hollow ones never really let you go. I should have known something was wrong the second I stepped out of the RV. The forest around me felt too still. The kind of stillness that makes you question whether the world itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But I brushed it off. I was in the middle of the Sawtooth National Forest, miles from any other campers or hikers. This was exactly what I wanted. Complete isolation. This place was going to make for the perfect series on my channel. Unmarked Trails. I'd call it a deep dive into forgotten paths, places people were too afraid to explore. And this one, it had all the elements of a viral video. No one knew much about the unmarked trail I was hunting, only vague rumors of hikers disappearing and whispered stories of something called the Collector. Something about that name intrigued me. I wasn't one to believe in folklore or ghost stories, but my audience loved them, and that's what mattered. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. I hiked, filmed B-roll footage, and narrated into my camera about the history of the area. The trail I was following wasn't exactly easy to find. I had to rely on a few tips from locals, a vague map sketched by a guide at a general store, and a lot of guesswork. But I found it, an overgrown path cutting into the forest, almost hidden by the surrounding brush. Perfect. This is it. I said into the camera, feeling the excitement bubble up. The forgotten trail. I spent that afternoon hiking along it, deeper into the wilderness than I'd planned. Time got away from me, but the sun was still up, casting golden light through the canopy. I knew I had to head back to camp soon, but the trail kept pulling me further. I wanted more footage, more content for the channel. By the time I returned to my RV, dusk was settling in. I set my gear down, sat by the fire I'd built earlier, and reviewed the footage. That's when I noticed it. In the background of one of my shots, there was something. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It was faint, barely visible, but definitely there, a tall, shadowy outline, watching me. I rewound the clip and zoomed in, but when I played it back again, the figure was gone. Just trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had been alone all day, hadn't I? It's nothing, I muttered to myself, shaking off the creeping unease. Probably a glitch in the camera, some kind of light distortion. I'd seen that before. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my eyes kept drifting back to the tree line, scanning for movement. Nothing. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me sit up in bed, ears straining, heart pounding. But the forest was quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves. Still, that feeling, the gnawing sensation of being watched, clung to me, even as the fire burned down to embers outside. The next morning, I pushed my nerves aside and geared up again. Today was the day I was going to push deeper into the trail. I was determined to find something, anything, that could give my channel the edge I was looking for. I packed my camera, drone, and enough supplies to last until nightfall. As I set off, something felt different. The forest had taken on an oppressive quality. The air was heavier, the light dimmer. The trail seemed to have changed too. The trees were growing closer together, the undergrowth thicker. Landmarks I thought I'd passed before were suddenly missing, or maybe I'd misremembered them. Either way, I felt more disoriented than I'd like to admit. But I pressed on. Several hours into the hike, my camera started malfunctioning. The battery, fully charged that morning, drained rapidly. The drone refused to take off. When I checked the footage I'd shot, static filled the screen, blurring everything. My frustration grew, but I wasn't about to quit. Not yet. That's when I saw it again. Ahead on the trail, the figure. It stood between two trees, far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough to feel its presence. Tall, impossibly tall, and still. My breath hitched as I fumbled for the camera, but by the time I raised it, the figure had vanished again. I stood frozen for a moment, my pulse racing. What the hell was that? I wasn't imagining things. There had been someone or something out there, but there was no sign of anyone now. No footprints, no rustling leaves, just silence. I should have turned back then. I should have packed up and left. But something deeper than curiosity kept me going. It was pride, maybe ego, the need to prove to myself that I wasn't just a YouTuber chasing shadows. I was a professional. I knew these woods. I pressed on, my mind racing with thoughts of how this footage, real or not, could be my breakthrough. I could see the thumbnails, the titles, the Cursed Collector trail captured on film. It would go viral, guaranteed. But as the hours dragged on, the trail seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone anymore. The sun, which should have been high in the sky, seemed to hang low, casting long shadows earlier than it should have. And then I heard the whispers. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the crunch of my boots on the dirt, but the deeper I went, the clearer they became. Voices, indistinct, like a conversation just out of earshot. I stopped, straining to listen. My heart thudded in my chest. Ryan. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but hearing my name sent a cold shiver down my spine. I spun around, scanning the forest, but there was no one. Just trees. And then there it was again. The figure, closer this time. It stood in the shadows, tall and unmoving, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I took a step back, my breath quickening. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. Ryan. The voice was clearer now, coming from the figure. My legs felt heavy, frozen in place as I stared, unable to look away. It didn't move, didn't approach. It just stood there, watching. I fumbled for my camera, hands shaking, but when I hit record, the screen flickered and went black. The battery was dead again. My phone, too, completely drained, though it had been fully charged that morning. Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted down the trail, half my feet pounding the dirt. But no matter how far I ran, the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The landscape twisted around me, trails splitting off in directions I hadn't seen before, paths looping back on themselves. I was trapped. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree, my head spinning. The whispers hadn't stopped. They circled around me now, growing louder, more insistent. Come deeper. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear that clouded my mind. I wasn't going to let this happen. I'd survived worse. I just needed to think, to get my bearings. But then I saw it. My camp. The RV. I stumbled forward, relief flooding through me as I reached the clearing. But something was wrong. The RV looked different, older, like it had been sitting there for years, weathered and decaying. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. I had only been gone a day, 2 at most, but the way the RV sagged, its windows cracked, and the rust that ate away at the metal, it felt like I'd been gone for much longer. Ryan. The voice was right behind me. I turned, and there it was. The collector. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its shadows stretching toward me, its eyes glowing brighter now, like embers in the dark. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Ryan, come with me. The collector's voice was a low whisper, soft and inviting, pulling at me, urging me to follow. It took a step forward, and I could feel its presence, heavy and cold, as though the very air around me had thickened. No, I choked out, my voice barely audible. The collector's eyes burned into me, its shadow growing longer, reaching out. I stumbled backward, finally breaking free of the paralysis that gripped me. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted into the trees, away from the RV, away from the trail. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and shifting as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. The whispers followed me, echoing in my ears, growing louder and louder until they became a roar. But I kept running, pushing through the exhaustion, the fear, the disorientation. I didn't stop until the first light of dawn broke through the trees, and when I finally did, I realized I had made it out. The forest was still behind me, the whispers gone, the collector nowhere in sight. I was alive, but I didn't feel relief, only emptiness. I left the Sawtooth National Forest that day, my RV abandoned where it had been claimed by the forest. I never posted the footage. There was nothing to show anyway, just static, shadows, and whispers. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the collector calling my name, waiting. I wasn't sure why I'd come back. Maybe it was the need for closure, a way to put everything behind me. It had been over a year since my wife Sarah passed away, and ever since, I'd been drifting through life, avoiding people, and dodging their well-meaning questions. When I was a park ranger, the forest had always been my sanctuary. And I thought maybe, just maybe, a trip back to the Cherokee National Forest would help clear my head. But as I parked my RV in a secluded spot deep in the forest, far away from the designated campsites, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was a mistake. The sun was setting, casting long shadows between the trees, and I watched the colors fade into darkness as I set up camp. The last time I'd been here was with Sarah, years ago, when life still made sense. Now it was just me, alone with my thoughts. I wanted the isolation. I needed the silence, or at least that's what I told myself. I sat by the fire, the crackle of the flames the only sound in the stillness of the forest. The night pressed in around me, thick and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. I stared into the fire, my mind drifting back to Sarah. I could almost hear her laugh, see her smile through the flickering flames. That's why I was here, to say goodbye, to finally let her go. I thought this place, our place, would help me find some peace. I was wrong. It started with a phone call. I'd turned my phone off the moment I arrived, didn't want any distractions, didn't need anyone bothering me. But as I sat there, staring into the flames, I heard it, the familiar sound of my phone ringing. I frowned, confused. I hadn't turned it back on. Slowly, I stood up and walked over to where I'd left it on the small table inside the RV. The screen was glowing, showing an unknown number. How was that possible? I had no signal out here, not this far from the nearest cell tower. Curiosity got the better of me. I answered the call. Hello? My voice was rougher than I expected, a little shaky at first. There was nothing but static, a low hum that buzzed in my ear. I was about to hang up when I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable. Dan. I froze. My blood turned to ice. It was Sarah's voice. Dan, it's me. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing to find some logical explanation. It had to be a prank, some sick joke. But the voice, it was hers. The way she said my name, that soft, familiar tone. Sarah, I whispered, barely able to get the word out. The static surged louder now, drowning out the voice. I called out again, but the line went dead. I stood there in the RV, staring at the phone in my hand, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. What the hell just happened? I checked the call log. Nothing. No record of the call. It was like it had never happened. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind. Grief does strange things to people. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I just wanted to hear her voice again so badly that my mind had created it. But as I sat back down by the fire, the unease gnawed at me. Something felt wrong. The night wore on, and the fire died down to embers. I retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. The quiet felt oppressive now, too heavy. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to forget the sound of her voice. Then the phone rang again. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my ears. The screen glowed in the dark, the same unknown number flashing across it. I hesitated this time, but eventually answered. Dan? The voice was clearer now, more distinct. It was Sarah, no doubt about it. Come to me. The line crackled, and for a moment, I swore I heard something else. A faint knocking sound, like someone tapping on the walls of the RV. I jumped out of bed and hurried to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing. Just the dense forest, silent and still. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to calm myself down. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think rationally. There was no way Sarah could be calling me. She was gone. I knew that. I'd buried her. But the voice, it was so real. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the RV had me on edge. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. The next day, I tried to distract myself. I hiked some familiar trails, took in the beauty of the forest, and reminded myself why I loved this place. But the feeling of unease never left me. It lingered like a shadow, always just out of sight. That evening, as I sat by the fire again, my phone rang. I stared at it, dread pooling in my stomach. The same unknown number, the same impossible call. I let it ring, watching the screen until it finally stopped. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking maybe it was over. But then the RV shook. It was subtle at first, just a faint tremor, like something had bumped into it. I stood up, glancing around the campsite. No wind, no animals. Nothing that could have caused it. Then I heard the knocking again, soft, deliberate, like someone tapping on the side of the RV. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but there was no one there, just the empty forest, silent as ever. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. It had to be an animal, a deer maybe. But as I turned back to the RV, I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the trees. It was too far to make out clearly, but it looked like a person. My heart skipped a beat. Hello? I called, my voice shaky. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, squinting into the darkness. The figure stepped back, disappearing into the trees. I ran after it, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Wait! But when I reached the spot where the figure had been, there was nothing. No tracks. No signs that anyone had been there at all. Just me and the towering trees, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal hands. I turned back, my head spinning. This couldn't be real. It had to be the grief, the isolation messing with me. Maybe I'd finally lost it. As I walked back to the RV, my phone rang again. I didn't want to answer it, but I couldn't stop myself. I picked it up, my hand trembling. Dan, I'm here. Come to me. The voice was so clear now, so real. It sounded like Sarah was right there with me, just out of reach. I miss you, she whispered. Come find me. My chest tightened. Tears stung my eyes. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe she was still out there, waiting for me. But I knew it wasn't her. It couldn't be. I slammed the phone down and ran into the RV, locking the door behind me. The knocking started again, louder this time, more insistent. Something wanted me to open that door. Something wanted me to follow. I sat there in the darkness, listening to the knocks, the whispers, my heart racing. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The following day, I packed up camp. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I needed to leave now. But the forest had other plans. As I drove through the winding forest roads, trying to make my way back to the main road, I realized something terrifying. I was lost. No matter which turn I took, I ended up back in the same place. The same trees, the same path. The forest was keeping me here. My phone rang again. I ignored it, but the knock came back, echoing through the RV, louder and louder, until I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, jumping out of the RV, screaming into the trees. Leave me alone! The forest answered with silence, and then the whispers returned. Sarah's voice rising on the wind, calling to me, luring me deeper into the trees. I didn't follow. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed the only thing I had left, my lighter. I built a fire bigger than any I'd made before, at the flames roaring into the sky. The knock stopped. The whispers faded. The forest was quiet again. But I knew, deep down, it wasn't over. I eventually found my way out, back to civilization, but I left the RV behind. I couldn't bring myself to take it with me. I knew what was waiting in those woods. I never went back to the Cherokee National Forest, and every night when the phone rings, I don't answer because I know it's not her. People say the Appalachian forests are haunted. I'd heard the rumors, whispers of restless spirits and strange disappearances, but I'd never given them much thought. After years of debunking ghost stories as a journalist, I became the kind of person who trusted facts, not folklore. Still, I couldn't resist the pull of Pisgah National Forest. It was remote, beautiful, and full of forgotten places that no one cared to visit anymore. Perfect for the series I'd been working on for my blog, Ghost Towns of the Forgotten South. This was my passion now. Traveling, exploring the lost corners of America, and turning those empty spaces into stories. This time, I was after an old settlement deep in the forest, one that most people in town wouldn't even talk about. There were no records of why it had been abandoned, just strange rumors of sickness and disappearances. But those stories were always embellished over time. People loved their spooky tales, and it was my job to sift the truth from the legend. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near the trailhead, not far from the ghost town, or what remained of it. I planned to spend a couple of nights out here, explore, take some pictures, and maybe talk to a few locals who might know more about its history. The air was crisp and cool as I stepped outside. The towering trees cast long shadows, making it feel later than it was. As I set up camp, I noticed how unnaturally quiet the forest was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I brushed it off. Deep forests always had a strange stillness about them. I'd been in enough of them to know that the real danger was tripping over a root, not some ghostly figure hiding behind the trees. That first night, I woke to a distant sound, like laughter. It was faint, barely a whisper on the wind. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. Could there be other campers out here? I doubted it. This part of the forest wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot. My phone was dead, but I'd recorded some video earlier in the day. I grabbed my camera and replayed the footage. There it was, faint, like a breeze blowing through, but unmistakable. Children's laughter. I pushed it out of my mind and went back to sleep. I had a lot of ground to cover tomorrow, and the last thing I needed was to let my imagination run wild. The next day, I set out to find the old settlement. It was slow going. Thick overgrowth and fading trails made navigation difficult. The map I had was basic, nothing more than a dotted line leading me deeper into the woods. The farther I went, the heavier the air felt, like the forest was closing in around me. But I kept going, determined to find this place. After about an hour, I noticed carvings, symbols strange and jagged, etched into the bark of the trees. They weren't any kind of writing I recognized, but they gave me an uneasy feeling. Maybe it was some old superstition, a way to ward off bad spirits. I took a few photos and kept moving. It was another hour before I finally found it. The ghost town was just as eerie as I'd imagined. Small, dilapidated cabins stood in clusters, some half collapsed under the weight of time and nature. Weeds and vines crept over everything, reclaiming the land. I walked through the empty streets, my camera clicking as I captured the desolation, the eerie stillness. That's when I saw the cemetery, small, tucked away behind what must have been the church, though the building itself was nothing more than a few rotting beams. The graves were old, the names barely legible, but the dates caught my eye. Some of them were from decades ago, but others were from the future. My first instinct was that it had to be a mistake, some kind of misprint or vandalism, but the stones looked too old, too weathered to be recent. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped back from the graves. It didn't make sense, and I didn't like the feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I realized then that I hadn't heard anything. Not birds, not insects, nothing since I'd arrived. I packed up my camera and headed back toward my RV. I'd gotten what I came for and figured I'd do some research on the strange gravestones when I got back to town. But something was wrong. The trail didn't look right. I was sure I'd come from this direction, but now the trees seemed different. The symbols I'd passed earlier weren't there anymore, and the forest seemed denser, more oppressive. My pulse quickened. I was lost. That was impossible. I never got lost, not with GPS and maps, not with all the preparation I'd done. I kept walking, trying to retrace my steps, but the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. Every turn led me to unfamiliar territory, and soon the forest looked completely foreign. My sense of time slipped away, and the sky started to darken, even though it felt like midday. Then I saw it, just ahead, through the trees. A figure stood on the trail, tall and motionless, watching me. I stopped cold, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding smaller than I'd intended. No response. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, squinting through the gloom, but as I did, it vanished, just gone. I spun around, scanning the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. My hands shook as I adjusted my pack. This was wrong. Everything was wrong. The sun had nearly set by the time I found my RV. It was parked where I left it, but somehow the journey back had taken hours longer than it should have. My legs were aching, my mind spinning with confusion. I climbed inside, locking the door behind me and collapsing onto the bed. That's when the laughter started again, louder this time, right outside the RV. I shot up, my heart pounding. I could hear them, children laughing and running around, their voices bouncing off the trees. I grabbed the camera, pointing it toward the window. But the moment I did, the laughter stopped. The forest was silent again, suffocating in its stillness. I played back the footage on the camera, hoping to catch something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But instead, I heard something else. A voice, clear as day, whispering my name. "Alex." I froze. The camera dropped from my hands and hit the floor with a thud, the sound echoing in the empty RV. Something was out there, and it knew my name. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed, every muscle tense, listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. I thought about leaving, driving out of the forest and abandoning the project altogether. But the RV wouldn't start. I tried the engine a dozen times, but it was dead. Dead as if the battery had drained overnight. My phone was useless, still dead from the day before. I was completely cut off. The next morning, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't stay here, not with whatever was out there watching me. I remembered the symbols on the trees, the strange carvings I'd seen on my hike. They had to mean something. Maybe they were the key to getting out of here. I grabbed my camping knife and headed back into the woods. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of dread. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep walking. I found the first symbol carved into the bark of a tree just off the trail. With a deep breath, I drove the blade into the wood, carving through the lines. As soon as the symbol was broken, the air shifted. The forest seemed to shudder, and for a moment, I thought I heard a scream, a distant echo and wail carried on the wind. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but I kept going. I found the next tree and did the same, cutting through the strange lines with my knife. The voices grew louder, the laughter, the whispers, all swirling around me like a storm. I could see the figures now, darting between the trees, shadowy, faceless figures watching, waiting. They wanted me to stop. They didn't want me to leave. But I wasn't going to be trapped here, not like them. I reached the final tree, my hands trembling as I raised the knife. The voices were deafening now, the figures closing in, but I didn't stop. With one last slash, I broke the symbol. And just like that, the voices stopped. The forest went still. The shadows vanished, and the oppressive weight that had hung over me lifted. I stumbled back toward my RV, half expecting the figures to reappear, but the woods were empty. When I got back, the engine started on the first try. I didn't look back as I drove out of the forest, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. I wasn't going to write about this place. I wasn't going to tell anyone what happened here. Some things are better left forgotten. I've always believed that everything has an explanation. Ghost stories, strange occurrences, they're all just misinterpretations of reality. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV deep into the desert, chasing the Marfa lights, one of those unexplained phenomena that people love to whisper about. I was determined to demystify them, capture them on camera, and show the world that there was nothing supernatural about it. The desert stretched out before me, flat and endless, the sky a deep cloudless blue. I'd parked my RV on the outskirts of Marfa, Texas, far enough from the town to avoid any distractions. The lights were supposed to appear at night, floating out there in the desert like glowing orbs. People called them spirits or even UFOs, but I knew better. I was here to photograph them, document them, and move on. That first night was quiet. too quiet. I set up my camera gear just outside the RV, tripods locked in place, lenses ready for long exposure shots. The desert was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you've been buried under a blanket. No wind, no animals, not even the hum of distant cars. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I'd been alone in the wild before. This was nothing new. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up and call it a night, the lights appeared. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable, small glowing orbs that hovered just above the horizon. I leaned forward in my chair, eyes fixed on them. They weren't anything special, just some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, I thought. But then, they moved slowly, almost deliberately. They floated closer, their soft glow reflecting off the desert sand. I snapped photo after photo, my fingers flying over the camera buttons. This was exactly what I'd come for. Clear, undeniable evidence. No one could call this supernatural nonsense once I had the data. But the lights were behaving differently than I expected. They weren't just floating randomly. They were almost watching me. I stood up, staring at the lights as they hovered, flickering softly, maybe 50 yards away. Then suddenly, they darted closer. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped back instinctively. The lights pulsed, brightening for a moment before retreating, as if they were playing with me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. Just lights, just gases or atmospheric anomalies, nothing to be afraid of. But the way they moved, it was like they were alive. I shook my head, frustrated. "Focus, Greg. It's all explainable," I muttered to myself. I turned back to my camera gear, checking the shots I'd taken. That's when the first problem started. The images were completely corrupted. Every shot I'd taken of the lights was ruined. Nothing but distorted lines and static, like an old TV losing signal. I flipped through the photos in disbelief. The lights had been right there, clear as day, but my camera had failed to capture a single usable image. My stomach churned. That wasn't right. I'd tested all the equipment before I left. I'd checked the camera, adjusted the settings, but the battery was draining fast, too fast. The indicator flashed red, and within seconds, the camera died in my hands. "Damn it," I hissed, grabbing my backup battery, but it was no use. Everything, camera, spare batteries, even my phone, was losing power faster than it should. It was like something was draining the life out of my equipment. Frustrated, I packed up my gear and headed back into the RV, locking the door behind me. I tried not to think about the lights still hovering outside, flickering just beyond the window. It had to be a glitch, I told myself. I'd deal with it in the morning. But I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing in around me. Every so often, I'd glance at the window, expecting to see the lights hovering there. I didn't want to admit it, but something about them unnerved me. The following day, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent hours checking my gear, trying to figure out what had gone wrong, but everything looked fine. The equipment was fully functional again, as if nothing had happened. It was strange, but I wasn't about to let one weird night stop me. I'd try again tonight, capture the lights properly this time. As evening fell, I set up my gear again, determined to make up for last night. The desert was still, the sky a dull orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. I watched, waiting for the lights to appear, and they did. But this time, they were closer. They floated just above the sand, pulsing softly, glowing brighter than before. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them move. Their rhythm was almost hypnotic. But it wasn't just their movement that startled me. It was the fact that they seemed to be getting nearer. I reached for my camera, ready to capture them again, but the battery was dead. Again. I checked my phone. Dead. Panic flickered at the edge of my mind. This wasn't possible. The lights were now just 30 feet away, their glow casting long shadows on the ground. They pulsed brighter, flickering in strange, almost deliberate patterns. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like they were trying to communicate. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the wind brushing past my ear. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer. "Greg." My blood ran cold. I whipped around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one, just the empty desert. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Greg." I backed toward the RV, my pulse racing. This wasn't right. This wasn't explainable. The lights were hovering just a few feet away now, And the whispers, they were inside my head. I scrambled into the RV, slamming the door shut behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. The lights were outside the window, pulsing, flickering. The whispering continued, filling the small space with eerie, disembodied voices. I tried to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power, no escape. The lights pressed closer, their glow filling the RV, casting strange shadows on the walls. I felt them, those whispers crawling into my mind, telling me to come outside, to follow them into the desert. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I wasn't going to let this beat me. I wasn't going to give in to fear. But then the lights began to move. They circled the RV faster and faster, like they were closing in on me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Follow the lights. I felt a tug, a pull in my chest, as if the lights were calling me, drawing me out of the RV. I fought against it, but it was getting harder to resist. The lights flickered faster, the whispers filling my head until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed my jacket and kicked the door open, running into the desert. The lights followed, darting around me, leading me deeper into the night. I stumbled through the sand, my heart pounding. The whispers guided me further from the RV, but something inside me snapped. I stopped running, gasping for air, and turned to face the lights. I wasn't going to follow them. I wasn't going to disappear like so many before me. "No!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I won't go." The lights pulsed, flickering faster. The whispers screamed in my head, but I stood my ground, forcing myself to ignore them. Slowly, the lights began to fade. The whispers grew softer until they were nothing more than faint echoes in the wind. I stumbled back to the RV, exhausted, my mind spinning. The lights were gone, retreating into the desert, but I knew they'd be back. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. By morning, I packed up and left Marfa. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the desert, far from the lights. I never told anyone what happened. No one would believe me anyway. But I'll never forget those lights, the way they moved, the way they whispered my name. I came here to prove they were just a natural phenomenon, just an unexplained mystery of the desert. But now I know better. Some things aren't meant to be explained, and some lights should never be followed. I should have known better than to trust an unmarked road. After years of travel writing, you'd think I'd have a sharper instinct for bad decisions, but there I was, driving deeper into Ford Pinchot National Forest, chasing a forgotten trail that was supposed to lead me to a ghost town no one could find anymore, vanished off the map. The ranger at the visitor center had said with a grin, "People go looking for it and never see it again. It's like the road just swallows you up." He laughed, but I could see the glint in his eye. He loved spinning those kinds of tales for tourists. But I wasn't a tourist. I was a writer, damn it. I had an assignment to finish, and there was no room for ghost stories. I followed the narrow, crumbling logging road as it wound deeper into the trees. My RV rattled along, tires crunching over fallen branches and loose gravel. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig, but I kept going. I'd done my research, and this was the right way, even if the forest seemed determined to reclaim the path. It had been a long day, and I was eager to set up camp and relax before exploring the area the next morning. The further I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the late afternoon sun. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need it. I was prepared. I had maps. I was confident I didn't get lost easily. But as I rounded the last bend in the road, something changed. The sky had been clear earlier, but a dense fog was rolling in now, thick and fast. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The road, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to dissolve into a gray blur. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. Just up ahead, a small clearing appeared through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough room for me to park the RV. I didn't have many other options. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The fog clung to everything, making the air feel damp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold, not in early fall. The chill crept into my bones, but I pushed it aside and started setting up camp. Something about the silence gnawed at me, though. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness in that damned fog. I finished my setup quickly, then retreated to the warmth of the RV. I wasn't nervous, but the quiet was getting under my skin. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settled into the driver's seat, and pulled out my maps. I spread them across the dash, looking for my next move. The ghost town was supposed to be less than a mile away, hidden deep in the woods, down a trail that was barely marked. Tomorrow, I'd hike to it, get my pictures, take some notes, and be done with it. Easy. But something was off. The road I'd driven on wasn't showing up on the map anymore. I traced the route with my finger, confused. The road was here. I'd just come down it, but now on the map, it wasn't anywhere to be found. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the windshield at the fog-shrouded forest. The ranger's words echoed in my mind, vanished off the map. I laughed softly to myself. It was a joke, a tall tale to scare off amateur hikers. Nothing more. Still, when I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I felt it again, that unsettling stillness. The fog was thicker now, curling around the RV like tendrils. I looked back toward the road I'd driven in on, but it wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stepped forward, peering into the mist. No road, just an unbroken line of trees. My stomach tightened. I walked a few more steps, hoping the road would reappear, but it didn't. The forest was dense, the trees close together. There was no sign of the path I had taken just hours earlier. It was as if it had been swallowed whole. I jogged back to the RV, heart racing now. I grabbed my flashlight and marched back to where the road should have been, sweeping the beam through the fog, but all I could see were trees, tall, dark, and oppressive. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The road couldn't just vanish. I hadn't gotten lost. I couldn't have. But when I turned back toward the RV, I felt it, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I swung the flashlight around, heart pounding, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the fog. A figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. Hello? My voice cracked. I regretted speaking as soon as the word left my mouth. The fog swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. I backed toward the RV, my nerves on edge, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't out to let a little fog and a missing road freak me out, but something felt wrong. The rational part of my brain was trying to make sense of it. Fog could play tricks on your eyes, and maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere. That was all. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next hour pacing the length of the RV, checking and rechecking my maps, trying to retrace my route in my head. Nothing made sense. The road had been there. I hadn't imagined it. By nightfall, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The temperature had dropped even more, and I cranked up the RV's heater, wrapping myself in blankets. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, soft thuds like footsteps outside, and whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. It had to be the fog, I told myself. It was distorting sound, making me paranoid. But when I woke in the middle of the night, there were voices. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them, faint, murmuring voices coming from outside. I crawled to the front of the RV, heart hammering, and peered through the windshield. The figures were back. This time, there were more of them. Shadows in the fog, standing still, watching. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. I scrambled to turn on the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power. The RV was silent, cold, and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically, but my heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic. The road was gone, the figures were back, and now I was trapped here. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and burst out of the RV. The cold hit me like a slab. I marched toward where the road had been, determined to find it, but the forest had shifted. The trees were closer now, the fog denser. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape stayed the same. It was as if I was walking in circles. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the RV. I could hear the voices again, closer now. They echoed through the fog, indistinct and ghostly. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows appeared again. Closer this time, standing just beyond the beam of light. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving. The figures were out there, circling me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed against the windows, and the shadows loomed outside, never coming closer but never leaving. Morning came, though I could barely tell. The fog hadn't lifted, and the road was still gone. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I turned the RV around, driving slowly back the way I'd come. If the road was there, I couldn't see it. All I could do was follow the same path I'd taken before, hoping it would lead me out. But it didn't. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a straight line through the fog, leading nowhere. And as I drove, I realized with sinking dread that I was still trapped. The road hadn't taken me anywhere. I was driving in circles, and the figures were still there, watching, waiting. They had me now. The vanishing road wasn't just a story. It was real, and I wasn't getting out. I've always believed that everything has an explanation. Ghost stories, strange occurrences, they're all just misinterpretations of reality. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV deep into the desert, chasing the Marfa lights, one of those unexplained phenomena that people love to whisper about. I was determined to demystify them, capture them on camera, and show the world that there was nothing supernatural about it. The desert stretched out before me, flat and endless, the sky a deep, cloudless blue. I'd parked my RV on the outskirts of Marfa, Texas, far enough from the town to avoid any distractions. The lights were supposed to appear at night, floating out there in the desert like glowing orbs. People called them spirits or even UFOs, but I knew better. I was here to photograph them, document them, and move on. That first night was quiet, too quiet. I set up my camera gear just outside the RV, tripods locked in place, lenses ready for long exposure shots. The desert was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you've been buried under a blanket. No wind, no animals, not even the hum of distant cars. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I'd been alone in the wild before. This was nothing new. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up and call it a night, the lights appeared. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable, small glowing orbs that hovered just above the horizon. I leaned forward in my chair, eyes fixed on them. They weren't anything special, just some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, I thought. But then, they moved slowly, almost deliberately. They floated closer, their soft glow reflecting off the desert sand. I snapped photo after photo, my fingers flying over the camera buttons. This was exactly what I'd come for, clear, undeniable evidence. No one could call this supernatural nonsense once I had the data. But the lights were behaving differently than I expected. They weren't just floating randomly, they were almost watching me. I stood up, staring at the lights as they hovered, flickering softly, maybe 50 yards away. Then suddenly, they darted closer. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped back instinctively. The lights pulsed, brightening for a moment before retreating, as if they were playing with me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. Just lights, just gases or atmospheric anomalies, nothing to be afraid of. But the way they moved, it was like they were alive. I shook my head, frustrated. "Focus, Greg, it's all explainable," I muttered to myself. I turned back to my camera gear, checking the shots I'd taken. That's when the first problem started. The images were completely corrupted. Every shot I'd taken of the lights was ruined. Nothing but distorted lines and static, like an old TV losing signal. I flipped through the photos in disbelief. The lights had been right there, clear as day, but my camera had failed to capture a single usable image. My stomach churned. That wasn't right. I'd tested all the equipment before I left. I'd checked the camera, adjusted the settings, but the battery was draining fast. Too fast. The indicator flashed red, and within seconds, the camera died in my hands. "Damn it!" I hissed, grabbing my backup battery, but it was no use. Everything, camera, spare batteries, even my phone, was losing power faster than it should. It was like something was draining the life out of my equipment. Frustrated, I packed up my gear and headed back into the RV, locking the door behind me. I tried not to think about the lights still hovering outside, flickering just beyond the window. It had to be a glitch, I told myself. I'd deal with it in the morning. But I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing in around me. Every so often, I'd glance at the window, expecting to see the lights hovering there. I didn't want to admit it, but something about them unnerved me. The following day, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent hours checking my gear, trying to figure out what had gone wrong, but everything looked fine. The equipment was fully functional again, as if nothing had happened. It was strange, but I wasn't about to let one weird night stop me. I'd try again tonight, capture the lights properly this time. As evening fell, I set up my gear again, determined to make up for last night. The desert was still, the sky a dull orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. I watched, waiting for the lights to appear, and they did. But this time, they were closer. They floated just above the sand, pulsing softly, glowing brighter than before. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them move. Their rhythm was almost hypnotic. But it wasn't just their movement that startled me. It was the fact that they seemed to be getting nearer. I reached for my camera, ready to capture them again, but the battery was dead, again. I checked my phone. Dead. Panic flickered at the edge of my mind. This wasn't possible. The lights were now just 30 feet away, their glow casting long shadows on the ground. They pulsed brighter, flickering in strange, almost deliberate patterns. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like they were trying to communicate. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the wind brushing past my ear. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer. Greg. My blood ran cold. I whipped around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one, just the empty desert. The whisper came again, closer this time. Greg. I backed toward the RV, my pulse racing. This wasn't right. This wasn't explainable. The lights were hovering just a few feet away now, and the whispers, they were inside my head. I scrambled into the RV, slamming the door shut behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. The lights were outside the window, pulsing, flickering. The whispering continued, filling the small space with eerie, disembodied voices. I tried to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power, no escape. The lights pressed closer, their glow filling the RV, casting strange shadows on the walls. I felt them, those whispers crawling into my mind, telling me to come outside, to follow them into the desert. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I wasn't going to let this beat me. I wasn't going to give in to fear. But then, the lights began to move. They circled the RV faster and faster, like they were closing in on me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Follow. Follow the lights. I felt a tug, a pull in my chest, as if the lights were calling me, drawing me out of the RV. I fought against it, but it was getting harder to resist. The lights flickered faster, the whispers filling my head until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed my jacket and kicked the door open, running into the desert. The lights followed, darting around me, leading me deeper into the night. I stumbled through the sand, my heart pounding. The whispers guided me further from the RV. But something inside me snapped. I stopped running, gasping for air, and turned to face the lights. I wasn't going to follow them. I wasn't going to disappear like so many before me. No, I shouted, my voice trembling. I won't go. The lights pulsed, flickering faster. The whispers screamed in my head, but I stood my ground, forcing myself to ignore them. Slowly, the lights began to fade. The whispers grew softer until they were nothing more than faint echoes in the wind. I stumbled back to the RV, exhausted, my mind spinning. The lights were gone, retreating into the desert, but I knew they'd be back. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. By morning, I packed up and left Marfa. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the desert, far from the lights. I never told anyone what happened. No one would believe me anyway. But I'll never forget those lights, the way they moved, the way they whispered my name. I came here to prove they were just a natural phenomenon, just an unexplained mystery of the desert. But now I know better. Some things aren't meant to be explained, and some lights should never be followed. Here is the passage copied exactly as you requested. I should have known better than to trust an unmarked road. After years of travel writing, you'd think I'd have a sharper instinct for bad decisions. But there I was, driving deeper into Deford-Pinchau National Forest, chasing a forgotten trail that was supposed to lead me to a ghost town no one could find anymore. Vanished off the map. The ranger at the visitor center had said with a grin, people go looking for it and never see it again. It's like the road just swallows you up." He laughed, but I could see the glint in his eye. He loved spinning those kinds of tales for tourists. But I wasn't a tourist. I was a writer. Damn it. I had an assignment to finish, and there was no room for ghost stories. I followed the narrow, crumbling logging road as it wound deeper into the trees. My RV rattled along, tires crunching over fallen branches and loose gravel. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig, but I kept going. I'd done my research, and this was the right way, even if the forest seemed determined to reclaim the path. It had been a long day, and I was eager to set up camp and relax before exploring the area the next morning. The further I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the late afternoon sun. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need it. I was prepared. I had maps. I was confident I didn't get lost easily. But as I rounded the last bend in the road, something changed. The sky had been clear earlier, but a dense fog was rolling in now, thick and fast. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The road, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to dissolve into a gray blur. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. Just up ahead, a small clearing appeared through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough room for me to park the RV. I didn't have many other options. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The fog clung to everything, making the air feel damp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold, not in early fall. The chill crept into my bones, but I pushed it aside and started setting up camp. Something about the silence gnawed at me, though. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness in that damned fog. I finished my setup quickly, then retreated to the warmth of the RV. I wasn't nervous, but the quiet was getting under my skin. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settled into the driver's seat, and pulled out my maps. I spread them across the dash, looking for my next move. The ghost town was supposed to be less than a mile away, hidden deep in the woods, down a trail that was barely marked. Tomorrow, I'd hike to it, get my pictures, take some notes, and be done with it. Easy. But something was off. The road I'd driven on wasn't showing up on the map anymore. I traced the route with my finger, confused. The road was here. I'd just come down it, but now on the map, it wasn't anywhere to be found. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the windshield at the fog-shrouded forest. The ranger's words echoed in my mind, vanished off the map. I laughed softly to myself. It was a joke, a tall tale to scare off amateur hikers. Nothing more. Still, when I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I felt it again, that unsettling stillness. The fog was thicker now, curling around the RV like tendrils. I looked back toward the road I'd driven in on, but it wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stepped forward, peering into the mist. No road, just an unbroken line of trees. My stomach tightened. I walked a few more steps, hoping the road would reappear, but it didn't. The forest was dense, the trees close together. There was no sign of the path I had taken just hours earlier. It was as if it had been swallowed whole. I jogged back to the RV, heart racing now. I grabbed my flashlight and marched back to where the road should have been, sweeping the beam through the fog. But all I could see were trees, tall, dark, and oppressive. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The road couldn't just vanish. I hadn't gotten lost. I couldn't have. But when I turned back toward the RV, I felt it, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I swung the flashlight around, heart pounding, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the fog. A figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. "Hello?" My voice cracked. I regretted speaking as soon as the word left my mouth. The fog swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. I backed toward the RV, my nerves on edge, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't about to let a little fog and a missing road freak me out, but something felt wrong. The rational part of my brain was trying to make sense of it. Fog could play tricks on your eyes, and maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere. That was all. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next hour pacing the length of the RV, checking and rechecking my maps, trying to retrace my route in my head. Nothing made sense. The road had been there. I hadn't imagined it. By nightfall, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The temperature had dropped even more, and I cranked up the RV's heater, wrapping myself in blankets. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, soft thuds like footsteps outside, and whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. It had to be the fog, I told myself. It was distorting sound, making me paranoid. But when I woke in the middle of the night, there were voices. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them, faint, murmuring voices, coming from outside. I crawled to the front of the RV, heart hammering, and peered through the windshield. The figures were back. This time, there were more of them. Shadows in the fog, standing still, watching. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. I scrambled to turn on the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power. The RV was silent, cold, and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically, but my heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic. The road was gone, the figures were back, and now I was trapped here. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and burst out of the RV. The cold hit me like a slab. I marched toward where the road had been, determined to find it. But the forest had shifted. The trees were closer now, the fog denser. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape stayed the same. It was as if I was walking in circles. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the RV. I could hear the voices again, closer now. They echoed through the fog, indistinct and ghostly. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows appeared again. Closer this time, standing just beyond the beam of light. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving. The figures were out there, circling me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed against the windows, and the shadows loomed outside, never coming closer but never leaving. Morning came, though I could barely tell. The fog hadn't lifted, and the road was still gone. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I turned the RV around, driving slowly back the way I had come. If the road was there, I couldn't see it. All I could do was follow the same path I'd taken before, hoping it would lead me out. But it didn't. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a straight line through the fog, leading nowhere. And as I drove, I realized with sinking dread that I was still trapped. The road hadn't taken me anywhere. I was driving in circles, and the figures were still there, watching, waiting. They had me now. The vanishing road wasn't just a story, it was real, and I wasn't getting out. I've always found comfort in the silence of the woods, out here away from people, away from the world. You can think straight. George Washington and Jefferson National Forest had been my sanctuary for years, my escape from the clutter of civilization. But this time, something felt different. It was as if the land itself was holding a secret it didn't want to share. It had been a rough few months. Lisa left me, and I couldn't say I didn't see it coming. I'd been distant, losing myself in work, then losing the work altogether. I thought a few days alone, hunting and camping, would clear my head. I needed space, and the mountains were the only place I knew where I could truly breathe. The plan was simple. 3 days, 4 tops. Head out to the edge of Silent Pines, an area where the deer roam freely and the mountains are still untouched by the tourist crowd. I'd bag a buck, maybe 2, and return with meat for the freezer. Just me, my gear, and the quiet hum of nature. But it didn't take long for that comfort and hum to go disturbingly quiet. The first day was uneventful, at least at first. I parked my truck at the trailhead, loaded up my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and began the familiar hike into the heart of the forest. My boots crunched over the leaf-covered trail as I climbed higher, the dense trees closing in around me. The fresh mountain air was cool, the perfect kind of crisp that made you feel alive. But something was off. I noticed it halfway through the hike. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, were missing. There was only the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional creak of the trees swaying gently in the wind. I shook it off as nerves. It was always a little eerie out here in the deep woods, especially when you were alone. That was part of the appeal. I told myself it was just the tension I'd been feeling lately, everything weighing on my chest, turning normal things into problems. I set up camp in the clearing near the stream I remembered from previous trips. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountain ridge, casting long shadows over the landscape. The fire crackled warmly as I cooked up some canned stew, sipping from a tin cup of lukewarm coffee, trying to push away the gnawing feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until later that night, after the fire had burned low and I was stretched out in my sleeping bag, that I noticed the first real sign: footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an animal. I mean, what else could it be? Deer? Maybe a raccoon? But it didn't sound like that. It sounded like someone walking, a soft, deliberate crunch in the leaves, moving slowly as if it was circling the camp. I lay still, holding my breath, listening intently. The steps grew closer, then stopped. I sat up slowly, reaching for the flashlight and rifle by my side. The firelight flickered dimly, casting long, jittery shadows around the clearing, but there was nothing there. I scanned the tree line, heart pounding harder than I'd like to admit. Nothing moved, just trees standing tall and silent, watching. Must have been the wind, I muttered, my voice shaky. I lay back down, my grip tight on the rifle. I'd always prided myself on being a tough, no-nonsense kind of guy, but something about those footsteps didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the sound itself, it was the feeling that came with it, like I was being watched. The next morning, things got worse. My water jug was gone. I thought I'd been careful about where I left it, but maybe I hadn't sealed it tight. Maybe an animal dragged it off during the night. I searched the area, looking for signs of raccoons or coyotes, but all I found were footprints, human, barefoot, and small, like a child's. But what child would be wandering around the woods miles away from the nearest road in the dead of night? I crouched down, running my fingers over the soft dirt where the prints had pressed into the earth. They seemed fresh, leading in a slow, meandering pattern around the campsite before disappearing into the woods. My skin crawled, a chill running down my spine as I stared at the tracks, my mind racing through every possible explanation. None of them made sense. By midday, I had convinced myself it must have been some local kids playing a prank. Maybe I'd stumbled into someone's turf without realizing it. But as I hiked deeper into the woods, rifle ready, the sense of unease only grew stronger. Every step I took felt heavy, like the trees themselves were watching me, closing in tighter. Then I saw it. I was tracking a deer along the ridgeline when I noticed movement in the trees just ahead. At first, I thought it was the buck I'd been hunting, but then it stepped out into the clearing. A figure, tall, hunched, and gaunt. Its body was draped in shadow, but I could see the faint outline of its pale, too long limbs, twisted in ways a man shouldn't be. And those eyes, two glowing yellow eyes, staring right at me. I froze, rifle raised, heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the wind dead and still around us. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. Who the hell are you? I called out, my voice cracking in the silence. No answer. I swallowed hard, taking a step back. The figure disappeared into the trees as silently as it had appeared. My hands were shaking, the rifle's barrel wobbling as I lowered it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to tell myself it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, but I knew better. I'd seen it, and whatever it wasn't human. That night, the footsteps returned. Louder this time, circling the camp with purpose. I stayed awake, rifle in hand, listening to the crunch of leaves as it moved closer. Every time I thought I'd hear it right outside my tent, the steps would stop, leaving only the suffocating silence. I couldn't sleep, couldn't even close my eyes without imagining those yellow eyes watching me from the darkness. By the third day, I was a mess, exhausted, jumpy, paranoid. I hadn't seen the figure again, but I could feel it following me, watching. The forest, once my refuge, had become a prison. I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how fast I walked, no matter how deep I went, it was always just behind me, waiting. That afternoon, I found more footprints. This time, they were right outside my tent, circling it in strange, looping patterns. There were dozens of them, overlapping, almost chaotic, as if someone or something had danced around the camp all night. My heart raced as I traced the tracks, panic creeping into my bones. The final straw came that evening. I was sitting by the fire, trying to calm my nerves when I heard it again. The soft, whispering voice carried on the wind. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of the trees, but I could make out one thing clearly. It was my name. Nate. I shot to my feet, spinning around, scanning the darkened woods for any sign of movement. The voice called again, softer this time, but closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, stuffed it into my pack as fast as I could, heart pounding in my ears. I needed to leave now. Whatever was out there, whatever had been stalking me for days, wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real, and it wasn't going to let me go easily. As I slung my pack over my shoulder and reached for my rifle, I felt it, a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing at the edge of the firelight, was the figure, tall, twisted, with limbs too long and eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Its face was pale and gaunt, hollow eyes staring into me as if it could see straight through my skin and into my soul. I raised the rifle, but before I could pull the trigger, it vanished, just gone, like smoke dissolving into the night air. I ran. I didn't care about the trail, didn't care about my gear. I ran as fast as I could through the forest, branches slapping at my face, rocks and roots tripping me up as I sprinted blindly through the trees. I could hear it behind me, the soft crunch of footsteps following, never far behind. By the time I reached the trailhead, my lungs were burning, my legs felt like jelly, and my mind was racing with fear. I threw myself into the truck, slamming the door shut. The silence inside the cab was deafening. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, finally starting the engine and peeling out of there as fast as I could. Even now, weeks later, I can't get it out of my head. The figure, those eyes, the voice that called my name, luring me deeper into the woods. I haven't told anyone about it. No one would believe me anyway, just another man who got lost in the forest, right? But I know what I saw. I know what was out there. I haven't been back to the mountain since, and every time I close my eyes, I still see it, watching, waiting. New isolation. I'd spent years driving across the country chasing celestial events, camping in places no one else dared to go. Black Rock Desert was supposed to be no different. I'd chosen this spot because it was one of the darkest places in the United States, far from the light pollution of cities, with nothing but the stars above and the cracked earth below. A perfect place to watch the meteor shower I'd been anticipating for months. But the desert has a way of getting under your skin. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun blazing high, its rays bouncing off the endless white of the salt flats. The ground stretched out in every direction, flat and featureless, interrupted only by distant mountains rising like ghosts on the horizon. It was beautiful in a desolate way, the kind of place that makes you feel small and insignificant. Exactly what I needed. The RV's engine rumbled to a stop, kicking up dust as I parked. I opened the door, stepping into the dry, hot air. The silence was immediate. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of civilization, just a profound, almost oppressive stillness. I told myself it was peaceful, that this was what I wanted, a few days alone in the desert to focus on my photography and watch the night sky. But as I looked out over the vast expanse of cracked earth, a strange feeling settled in my chest, like a weight pressing down. I brushed it off. It had been a long drive, and the heat was getting to me. I'd feel better once the sun went down. I spent the first few hours setting up camp, adjusting my telescope, and testing my camera equipment. The sky was still a blazing blue, but the desert's unforgiving heat was beginning to fade, replaced by a sharp chill as the sun sank lower. By the time dusk arrived, the temperature had plummeted, and I retreated into the RV to grab a jacket before stepping back outside. That's when the radio first crackled to life. I'd brought my old ham radio along, hoping to catch some weather updates or maybe listen in on local astronomy broadcasts. I hadn't expected much out here, but the static-filled hum surprised me. I turned the dial, searching for a signal, and for a moment I thought I'd found one, a faint voice cutting through the static. "Don't stay." I froze. The words were barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind, but they were unmistakable. I leaned closer, adjusting the frequency, but the voice was gone, replaced by the familiar hiss of static. I turned the radio off, chalking it up to interference, old equipment, or weird atmosphere. Still, the unease in my chest was growing. The first night was incredible. The sky came alive with meteors streaking across the blackness, more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. I stood in awe, snapping pictures, adjusting my telescope, completely losing track of time. Out here, under the stars, the rest of the world felt far away. It was just me, the night, and the vastness of space. And yet, something nagged at me. When I reviewed the photos later, I noticed something strange in the background of one of my long exposure shots. There was a blur, a faint, almost imperceptible smudge. At first, I thought it was a mistake, dust on the lens maybe, or a glitch in the camera's settings. But as I scrolled through the rest of the images, the blur appeared again and again in each photo. It seemed to be getting closer to the RV. I wiped the camera lens, took another shot, and stared hard at the screen. Nothing. It had to be some kind of artifact from the desert air, the heat mixing with the cold night, playing tricks on the lens. Still, the feeling in my chest tightened. I turned in early, trying to push the unease aside, telling myself I'd check the equipment in the morning. Day 2 was different. I woke to a stifling heat that even the RV's air conditioning couldn't seem to fight. I cursed, fiddling with the controls, but the air blowing through the vents was weak and warm. I grabbed a bottle of water and stepped outside, hoping the breeze would provide some relief, but the air was dead still as the grave. I spent most of the day trying to fix the RV's engine, which had been acting sluggish since I arrived. I knew I should be enjoying the desert, but the more time I spent out there, the more the silence started to gnaw at me. It wasn't the peaceful isolation I had expected. It felt watchful. As the day dragged on, the sun beat down, turning the ground beneath my feet into a furnace. The radio, which had been quiet since last night's strange transmission, crackled to life again. This time, the voice was clearer. "Danger. You need to leave." I dropped the wrench I was holding, staring at the radio in disbelief. The voice was faint, distorted, like it was coming from miles away. But it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was speaking to me. I snatched up the radio, twisting the dial, trying to find the source. Static. Nothing but static. The voice was gone again, leaving me standing in the middle of the desert, sweat running down my back, my heart hammering in my chest. I should have left then. I should have packed up and driven out of there. But the RV's engine was still stalling, and part of me didn't want to admit that I was spooked. This was why I came out here, wasn't it? To face my fears, to be alone in the dark. I stayed. And that night, the shadows came. The meteor shower was more intense on the second night, the sky alive with fire and light. I sat by the RV, staring up at the heavens, the vastness of the universe overwhelming. But no matter how beautiful the stars were, my eyes kept drifting back to the edges of the desert, where the darkness seemed to pool, thick and impenetrable. It was there, at the far edge of my vision, that I first saw the figure. A shape, standing just beyond the reach of my campfire's light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the eye. The desert plays with your perception. Distances blur, shadows stretch. But when I blinked, the figure was still there, standing, watching. I grabbed my camera, adjusting the focus, snapping a shot before the figure disappeared. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe an animal or even another camper who'd wandered too close. But when I checked the camera's screen, my blood went cold. The figure wasn't human. It was tall, too tall, with elongated limbs and a strange, distorted form. It was like a shadow brought to life, a smear of darkness against the starlit sky. The more I stared at it, the more unreal it looked. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly lowered the camera. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The air was suddenly freezing, the kind of cold that bites at your skin. I retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me, my heart racing. I told myself I was imagining things. The desert played tricks on people. I'd read about it, people seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices carried on the wind. But that didn't explain the figure in the photo. The night dragged on, and I stayed awake, listening for anything, any sound, any movement. But all I heard was the persistent hum of the radio and the static growing louder by the minute. The next day, I knew I had to leave. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just my imagination. The figure, the voices, I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. I packed up as quickly as I could, but when I turned the key in the ignition, the RV sputtered and died. I tried again and again. Nothing. I stepped out into the desert, sweat pouring down my face. The heat was oppressive, and the silence pressed in on me, suffocating. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal, and the radio was useless, just a constant, garbled stream of static. Then the voice returned, louder than ever. Stay, come closer. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command. And when I looked out across the desert, I saw the figure again, closer this time, standing in the distance. Its form was hazy and indistinct, but unmistakable. It was waiting for me. My legs felt like lead as I backed toward the RV, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was freezing now, the warmth of the day gone, replaced by a bone-deep chill. I knew in that moment that if I stayed, I would become like the figure. A shadow, a ghost, trapped in this forsaken place, wandering the desert forever. I ran. I don't know how I got the RV started. Maybe it was adrenaline or maybe sheer panic. But when the engine finally roared to life, I slammed the gas pedal to the floor and didn't look back. The figure, the voice, the cold, they all faded into the distance as I sped across the salt flats, the desert stretching endlessly behind me. I never looked at the photos again. I couldn't. Whatever was out there, it was better left unseen. I'll never return to Black Rock Desert. Some places were meant to be empty. When you spend enough time alone, the silence becomes something else. It's no longer a backdrop, but a living, breathing thing that creeps in around the edges of your thoughts. I thought I liked the silence. That's why I had been living on the road for months, with no one but myself and my RV for company. But this trip to Ocala National Forest was supposed to be different. I needed to reset, to get my head straight. I guess that's what they all say before they lose it. The first day was easy enough. I set up camp on the edge of the forest, not far from one of the swamps that ran through Ocala. I had picked this spot on purpose, far enough from the touristy campgrounds, but close enough to the water to take some good photos. Photography had become my new hobby, something to fill the long stretches of time, something to keep my mind off Rachel. The forest was thick with towering pines and oaks, their branches twisting and closing in overhead. The light filtered through the leaves in a way that made the air seem heavy, almost suffocating, but it was peaceful. Or at least, I told myself it was. I parked the RV near a clearing, right where the swamp met the woods. The ground was firm enough, and I didn't think much of the water nearby. I had no reason to worry. Not yet. By the time I finished setting up, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing. The air was unnervingly still, like the whole forest was holding its breath, but I didn't mind. Solitude was the whole point. I sat outside for a while, watching the last of the light fade before retreating inside the RV. The hum of the small generator I had hooked up was the only sound breaking the silence. Everything seemed fine. Everything was fine, until the light started flickering. It was subtle at first, just a dimming of the overhead lights. I figured the wiring was faulty, nothing I couldn't fix. I'm a mechanic by trade, after all. I ignored it, settling in with a book, trying to lose myself in the words. But then the flickering got worse. The lights flashed on and off in rapid succession. The shadows in the RV danced wildly before everything went dark. I sighed, more frustrated than anything, and grabbed my flashlight. After a few minutes of fumbling with the wires, I got the power back on. The lights stabilized, but there was something else, a soft buzzing noise, faint, just at the edge of hearing, like a distant hum. It might have been the swamp, maybe bugs, or just the generator straining, but it set me on edge. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, the unease I'd felt the night before was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. The sunlight was warm, and the swamp shimmered in the early light. I grabbed my camera and set out for a walk, looking for something worth capturing. Ocala was known for its beauty, the kind of untouched wilderness that's hard to find these days. But the deeper I walked into the woods, the more I realized something was off. It started small, little things I could have easily ignored. My compass acting up, the needle spinning lazily before settling in the wrong direction. The buzzing sound from the night before returned, louder now, seeming to come from all around me. I chalked it up to the swamp mosquitoes, maybe, or some malfunction with the generator still ringing in my ears. But when I came back to camp, I noticed the first real sign that something wasn't right. My gear, things I'd left on the picnic table outside, was scattered across the ground, not in a way that suggested wind either. The table had been cleared. My flashlight, the lantern, the tools I'd left out, all of them were scattered in a perfect line toward the swamp. I stopped, staring at the items. Someone had been here, or something. I'm not easily spooked, but my gut told me to get back inside, lock the doors. That night, I sat in the RV, every light on, clutching a lantern just in case the power flickered again. I told myself it was fine. Probably some animal. Bears get curious, right? But when the tapping started, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was soft at first, just a light tapping on the window, like something brushing against it. I glanced over, but didn't see anything. I convinced myself it was the wind, the branches moving in the breeze. But then the tapping came again and again. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The swamp smelled foul, like rot and decay, and the buzzing sound was back, louder than ever. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the clearing, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, large, human-like prints, leading right up to the window of my RV. The mud was fresh, still wet from the swamp, and the prints were clear. But there were no other signs of anyone around, no trails leading away, just those prints, stopping right at the window. Then, nothing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to believe it was someone playing a prank, some camper messing with me. But I hadn't seen another soul since I got here. No cars at the trailhead, no signs of other campers nearby. I hurried back inside, locking the door, but I knew it wouldn't help. The feeling in my gut told me I was being watched. By the third day, I wanted out. I'd seen enough, but when I tried to start the RV, nothing happened. The engine clicked but wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but the RV refused to start. Panic settled in. My phone had no signal, this deep in the forest, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. The buzzing sound was louder now, constant, like a low hum in the back of my skull. I packed a bag and decided to hike out. Staying another night was out of the question. The trail was familiar enough, but something was different. The air was thick, stifling, and the swamp seemed to have crept closer. I hadn't noticed it before, but the water was rising, soaking the ground around my campsite. The once dried trail was now a muddy mess, slowing me down as I tried to navigate through the trees. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving between the trees, barely visible in the corner of my eye. I stopped, trying to focus, but every time I turned to look, they were gone. My heart raced. I pushed forward faster now, but the shadows followed me. They stayed just out of sight, flickering in and out of existence, like ghosts. By the time I reached the halfway point, the whispers started. It wasn't loud, just a faint, distant murmur, but it was unmistakable, voices speaking in a language I didn't understand, too quiet to make out the words. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing, just the trees, the swamp, and those damn shadows. The trail blurred before my eyes, and I stumbled, my head swimming. I couldn't think straight. The buzzing, the whispers, it was too much. I needed to get out of here. But no matter which way I turned, the trail led me back to the swamp. It was like the forest was folding in on itself, trapping me in a maze of water and trees. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and then I saw them. Standing at the edge of the swamp, barely visible in the twilight, were the figures. They were tall, too tall to be human, with elongated limbs and dark faces. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching me, their forms flickering in and out of the shadows, like something half-formed, not fully real. I backed away, my heart pounding, but they didn't follow. They didn't need to. The buzzing sound grew louder, the whispers more insistent. I turned and ran, not caring where the trail led. I just needed to get away. When I finally collapsed back at the RV, drenched in sweat and mud, the sun was already setting. The swamp had crept even closer, the water now lapping at the edges of the clearing. I locked myself inside, every light on, but it didn't matter. I could still hear them, the whispers, the tapping, the buzzing. It all grew louder, closing in on me from every side. I knew what was out there. I'd seen it, and it was only a matter of time before it got in. I sat there in the dark, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the moment when the door would creak open, waiting for the shadows to finally step into the light. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, days. The buzzing is in my head now, a constant hum I can't escape. The figures are closer. I can see them outside, just beyond the trees. Their eyes are glowing in the darkness. They're waiting for me, and I'm not sure how much longer I can resist. I should have known better than to trust an unmarked road. After years of travel writing, you'd think I'd have a sharper instinct for bad decisions. But there I was, driving deeper into Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, chasing a forgotten trail that was supposed to lead me to a ghost town no one could find anymore. Vanished off the map. The ranger at the visitor center had said with a grin, "People go looking for it and never see it again. It's like the road just swallows you up." He laughed, but I could see the glint in his eye. He loved spinning those kinds of tales for tourists. But I wasn't a tourist. I was a writer. Damn it. I had an assignment to finish, and there was no room for ghost stories. I followed the narrow, crumbling logging road as it wound deeper into the trees. My RV rattled along, tires crunching over fallen branches and loose gravel. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig, but I kept going. I'd done my research, and this was the right way, even if the forest seemed determined to reclaim the path. It had been a long day, and I was eager to set up camp and relax before exploring the area the next morning. The further I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the late afternoon sun. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need it. I was prepared. I had maps. I was confident I didn't get lost easily. But as I rounded the last bend in the road, something changed. The sky had been clear earlier, but a dense fog was rolling in now, thick and fast. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The road, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to dissolve into a gray blur. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. Just up ahead, a small clearing appeared through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough room for me to park the RV. I didn't have many other options. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The fog clung to everything, making the air feel damp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold, not in early fall. The chill crept into my bones, but I pushed it aside and started setting up camp. Something about the silence gnawed at me, though. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness in that damned fog. I finished my setup quickly, then retreated to the warmth of the RV. I wasn't nervous, but the quiet was getting under my skin. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settled into the driver's seat, and pulled out my maps. I spread them across the dash, looking for my next move. The ghost town was supposed to be less than a mile away, hidden deep in the woods, down a trail that was barely marked. Tomorrow I'd hike to it, get my pictures, take some notes, and be done with it. Easy. But something was off. The road I'd driven on wasn't showing up on the map anymore. I traced the route with my finger, confused. The road was here. I'd just come down it, but now on the map, it wasn't anywhere to be found. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the windshield at the fog-shrouded forest. The ranger's words echoed in my mind, "Vanished off the map." I laughed softly to myself. It was a joke, a tall tale to scare off amateur hikers. Nothing more. Still, when I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I felt it again, that unsettling stillness. The fog was thicker now, curling around the RV like tendrils. I looked back toward the road I'd driven in on, but it wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stepped forward, peering into the mist. No road, just an unbroken line of trees. My stomach tightened. I walked a few more steps, hoping the road would reappear, but it didn't. The forest was dense, the trees close together. There was no sign of the path I had taken just hours earlier. It was as if it had been swallowed whole. I jogged back to the RV, heart racing now. I grabbed my flashlight and marched back to where the road should have been, sweeping the beam through the fog, but all I could see were trees. Tall, dark, and oppressive. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The road couldn't just vanish. I hadn't gotten lost. I couldn't have. But when I turned back toward the RV, I felt it. That creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I swung the flashlight around, heart pounding, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the fog. A figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. Hello? My voice cracked. I regretted speaking as soon as the word left my mouth. The fog swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. I backed toward the RV, my nerves on edge, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't about to let a little fog and a missing road freak me out, but something felt wrong. The rational part of my brain was trying to make sense of it. Fog could play tricks on your eyes, and maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere. That was all. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next hour pacing the length of the RV, checking and rechecking my maps, trying to retrace my route in my head. Nothing made sense. The road had been there. I hadn't imagined it. By nightfall, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The temperature had dropped even more, and I cranked up the RV's heater, wrapping myself in blankets. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, soft thuds like footsteps outside, and whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. It had to be the fog, I told myself. It was distorting sound, making me paranoid. But when I woke in the middle of the night, there were voices. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them, faint, murmuring voices coming from outside. I crawled to the front of the RV, heart hammering, and peered through the windshield. The figures were back. This time, there were more of them. Shadows in the fog, standing still, watching. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. I scrambled to turn on the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power. The RV was silent, cold, and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically, but my heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic. The road was gone, the figures were back, and now I was trapped here. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and burst out of the RV. The cold hit me like a slab. I marched toward where the road had been, determined to find it, but the forest had shifted. The trees were closer now, the fog denser. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape stayed the same. It was as if I was walking in circles. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the RV. I could hear the voices again, closer now. They echoed through the fog, indistinct and ghostly. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows appeared again. Closer this time, standing just beyond the beam of light. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving. The figures were out there, circling me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed against the windows, and the shadows loomed outside, never coming closer, but never leaving. Morning came, though I could barely tell. The fog hadn't lifted, and the road was still gone. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. And as I drove, I realized with sinking dread that I was still trapped. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a straight line through the fog, leading nowhere. The figures were still there, watching, waiting. The vanishing road wasn't just a story. It was real, and I wasn't getting out. I thought a week alone in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest would be the perfect way to clear my head after everything that had happened. The divorce, leaving the military, and that nagging feeling I'd wasted years of my life. I figured some isolation would help me reset. So I packed up my RV, grabbed my gear, and drove deep into the heart of the forest. I should have known better when I first pulled into the campsite. I felt that familiar sense of calm I used to get on deployment. A kind of satisfaction that comes with being prepared for whatever the wilderness might throw at me. The Apache Sitgreaves is a vast, rugged place, and this far in, you don't see many other campers. That's why I picked it. No people, no distractions, just the forest, my RV, and my thoughts. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV at the edge of a tree line, overlooking a deep ravine. The view was incredible. The trees spread out like a sea of green with the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over the land. I spent the first day hiking, snapping a few photos of the landscape and trying to relax. By nightfall, the temperature dropped sharply, but I welcomed the cold. It felt like the world was trying to numb me, erase the pain I'd been carrying since Rachel left. I lit a small fire, sat by it, and let the quiet settle in. That's what I wanted after all, but the silence felt different out here. It wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. The first night passed uneventfully, but something woke me around 3 a.m. I sat bolt upright, listening. There it was again, a sound just outside the RV. It wasn't the usual rustle of wildlife or the distant call of an owl. No, this was different. Slow, deliberate footsteps. At first, I thought maybe another camper had wandered into my area, but when I peered through the window, all I saw was blackness, the dense trees illuminated only by the faint moonlight. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and biting. I swept the beam of light across the campsite, scanning the edges of the trees. The footsteps had stopped. Nothing moved. The fire had long since died out, leaving behind only a few glowing embers. No signs of anyone. I convinced myself it was probably just an animal and went back inside, locking the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, the hairs on the back of my neck stayed up, like I wasn't alone. By the second day, I was already starting to feel the isolation. The weather was turning colder than I'd expected, and to make matters worse, the RV's heater was acting up. It kept cutting out, leaving the inside freezing. At night, I spent hours trying to figure out what was wrong, but it was no use. I'd have to tough it out. I hiked out again that afternoon, looking for some distraction. The forest was beautiful, but in an unforgiving way. The trails were rough, and after a while, I veered off the main path looking for more secluded spots to explore. I told myself it was for the photography, but really, I just wanted to be somewhere no one could find me. That's when I first saw the carvings. At first, I didn't even notice them. They were subtle, old, just faint marks on the trees. I stopped to take a break and caught sight of one right in front of me. A series of lines etched into the bark, almost like a symbol. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the grooves. It wasn't natural. Someone or something had put it there. As I moved on, I found more of them, scattered and in no particular pattern, but close enough to make me uneasy. They circled the area where I'd set up camp, like some kind of boundary. I shook off the strange feeling gnawing at my gut. This forest was old. People had been here long before me, carving symbols and marks for reasons long forgotten. Nothing to worry about, but I didn't stop worrying. That night, I woke up again, the same time as before, 3 a.m. The footsteps were back, closer this time. The sound was unmistakable, soft but deliberate, like someone walking slowly around the RV, testing the ground with each step. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the RV, paused, then resumed. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for the flashlight but hesitated. What if it wasn't a person? What if it was something else? The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. Then I heard the tapping. Soft, rhythmic taps on the windows. My mouth went dry. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The taps grew louder, more insistent, coming from all sides of the RV now. I forced myself to get up slowly and crept to the nearest window. My hands shook as I pulled the curtain back just a little. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness outside. Nothing. Just the forest and the shadows. But when I looked again, I saw it. A handprint pressed against the glass. Smudged and distorted, like someone or something had leaned in close. The print was too large to be human. Its fingers were long, unnaturally so, and the palm had an odd, warped shape to it. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't know how long I stood there frozen, but the tapping eventually stopped. The air felt thick, like it was pushing down on me, suffocating me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my hunting knife, waiting for the footsteps to return. By the third day, I was ready to leave. I packed my gear and decided to head out early. Whatever had been out there the night before, I didn't want to find out. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but nothing. Dead. The frustration boiled over into panic. I was stranded. I grabbed my map and decided I'd have to hike out to the nearest ranger station, a few miles away. It wasn't ideal, but I couldn't stay here another night, not with whatever was out there. I set off down the trail moving fast. The cold had seeped into my bones, but I pushed on, hoping to make it before dark. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow hiding something just out of sight. And the feeling of being watched, it never went away. About halfway to the station, I heard it again, footsteps that weren't my own. I stopped, listening. My hand rested on the knife at my side. Then I heard a voice. It came from behind me, soft and distant. Liam. I froze. My blood ran cold. Liam, help me. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was Rachel's voice, my ex-wife, but she wasn't here. She couldn't be here. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. Liam? Her voice again, closer this time. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My mind was playing tricks on me. I started walking again, faster this time, my eyes darting around, looking for any sign of movement. The voice followed me, calling my name over and over. I clenched my fists, trying to block it out, trying to focus on the trail. But then I saw it, standing in the middle of the path, not 20 feet ahead. The figure was tall, too tall to be human. Its limbs were long and thin, draped in tattered rags that seemed to shift in the wind. Its face, there was no face, just a void, a swirling mass of darkness where its features should have been. Its eyes, though, its eyes were glowing, bright yellow, like two embers burning in the night. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I fumbled for my knife, holding it out in front of me, though I knew it wouldn't do any good. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no sense to it. This thing wasn't human. It wasn't natural. The Watcher, something from old Apache legends, stories I'd heard long ago, was real. And it had found me. The thing took a step forward, and I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. I don't remember much of the run. It was a blur of trees and shadows, the forest closing in on me as I tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes. The Watcher's eyes burned into my back. Somehow, I made it to the ranger station. I don't know how, but when I stumbled into the clearing and saw the small building, I nearly collapsed in relief. I burst through the door, breathless and shaking. The ranger inside looked up, startled, but I couldn't form the words to explain what had happened. I didn't need to. When I finally caught my breath, I told him everything. The footsteps, the handprints, the thing in the forest. He didn't believe me, of course. Why would he? He checked my RV later, saw the scratches and the smudged handprint, but still shrugged it off. Probably just a bear, he said. But I know better. As I sit here now, writing this down, I can still feel it. The Watcher's eyes on me. It's waiting, watching, and it'll follow me no matter where I go. Some things you can't outrun. I came to Red River Gorge to find peace, or at least that's what I told myself. When you've lost everything, when your life's fallen apart, nature feels like the only refuge. The solitude, the silence, they're supposed to help you clear your mind, right? But if I'd known what waited for me in those woods, I might have stayed home. I parked my old Jeep at the trailhead, strapped on my pack, and set off. The first day was perfect. The crisp autumn air had the faint smell of wet leaves, and the colors. God, the colors were dazzling. I'm a photographer by trade now, trying to make a name for myself since leaving teaching. The leaves, in their fiery oranges and deep reds, made the perfect backdrop for my shots. It was the kind of beauty you could get lost in. I guess that's what I was hoping for. The trail was tough, though, harder than I expected. The steep climbs had my legs burning, and my pack felt heavier with every step. I could feel the camera bouncing against my back, reminding me why I was here. The plan was simple. A week alone in the wilderness, just me, my gear, and enough food to get by. No distractions, no people, no Rachel. I shook the thought out of my head and kept walking, focusing on the landscape instead. The river was nearby, its faint gurgle a common soundtrack to the crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time the sun started to dip, I was more exhausted than I should have been. My muscles ached from the unfamiliar terrain, and blisters had already formed on my heels. I set up camp by the river. I'd brought an old tent that had seen better days, but I figured it would hold up fine for a week. The stove, a clearance sale special, was already giving me trouble. The flame flickered weakly, as if unsure of itself, and I ended up eating half-cooked noodles before giving up and settling into my sleeping bag. That first night, I didn't sleep well. At first, it was just the usual branches rustling, the wind whispering through the leaves. But around midnight, I heard something strange. It sounded like a voice, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees. I sat up, listening. It came again, too soft to make out words, but there was a rhythm to it, a cadence like speech. My heart began to pound. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe distant campers, but there had been no cars at the trailhead. I was alone out here. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day was harder. The trail was steep and my legs were sore from the day before. The scenery was still breathtaking, but the deeper I went into the gorge, the more oppressive it felt. The trees grew closer together, their branches blocking out the sun, casting long shadows that made the woods seem darker than they should have been. It was around midday when I first saw it. I was setting up a shot of a rocky outcrop, the kind of thing that might make a good feature for my portfolio, when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was that primal sensation, the one that tells you you're not alone. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, and there it was, just within the tree line, maybe 30 feet away. At first, I thought it was a person, someone tall and thin wearing a long, tattered coat, but something was off. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. "You're just seeing things," I muttered to myself. "It's nothing." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, clearer. I could almost make out words, but they were garbled, like someone trying to speak underwater. I lay in my tent, wide-eyed and tense, listening. The sound wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to swirl around the camp, circling me. I grabbed my flashlight, zipped open the tent, and shined the beam into the woods. There was nothing, just the trees, the river, the empty night. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry, my mouth frozen. I was too scared to make a sound, as if acknowledging it would make it real. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent fully and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap. My breath came in sharp, visible puffs as I scanned the darkness. Then I saw the footprints. They were large, human-shaped, and fresh, pressed into the damp earth around my tent. They hadn't been there before I went to bed. My heart raced as I knelt down to examine them. They circled my campsite as though someone or something had been watching me, walking around while I slept. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I backed away slowly, stumbling as I scrambled back into the tent and zipped it up as fast as I could. I huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers continued, relentless, until dawn. By the third day, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept, and every step felt like agony. My legs were leaden, my pack seemed twice as heavy, and my mind was unraveling. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart into overdrive. I wanted to leave, but I was too far in now. It would take me days to hike back out, and the thought of turning around filled me with a strange sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like the gorge itself didn't want me to leave, like it was holding me here, drawing me deeper into its clutches. I kept walking, pushing through the exhaustion, trying to ignore the whispers that still echoed in my head. By midday, I found myself near the river again, at a small clearing. I decided to stop and rest, hoping the sight of the water might calm me. But as I sat there, staring at the rippling current, I saw something across the riverbank. The figure. It was standing on the opposite shore, half hidden by the trees. I could see it more clearly now. Tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long for its body. It wore tattered, grayish rags that fluttered in the breeze. But its face was a blur, a smudge of darkness that seemed to shift and warp as I stared at it. My pulse quickened, and my breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I raised the lens, focused on the figure, and snapped the shutter. The moment I did, the figure flickered like static on an old TV. 1 second it was there, and the next, it wasn't. Gone. I lowered the camera, my hands trembling. My gut told me to leave, to get the hell out of here. but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by fear. The whispers returned, louder now, almost angry. They filled the air around me, a cacophony of voices speaking over each other, too fast to understand. And then I felt it, a cold, sharp pressure on my shoulder, like fingers pressing into my skin. I screamed, scrambling to my feet and backing away from the riverbank. The coldness followed me, clinging to me like invisible hands, trying to pull me down. I ran blindly, recklessly, away from the water, away from the voices. I didn't stop until I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The whispers had faded, but the cold lingered, sinking deep into my bones. I was shaking, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat by my dying campfire, clutching my camera, my eyes darting nervously around the darkened woods. The whispers had returned, but they were softer now, distant. I knew I wasn't alone. The figure, the wraith as I'd come to call it, was out there watching me, waiting for me. I tried to rationalize it, but there was no denying the truth anymore. This wasn't just my imagination. This wasn't a trick of the light or the wind playing games with my mind. There was something in these woods, something ancient, something angry. On the 5th day, I decided to leave. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking with nervous energy. I didn't care how long it took. I had to get out of this place. But the gorge had other plans. As I made my way back toward the trailhead, the path seemed to shift beneath my feet. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the way out. Every turn brought me back to the same spot, the same trees, the same stretch of river. It was like the forest was folding in on itself, trapping me in a maze of endless woods. And then I saw it again. The wraith. It stood in the distance, half hidden by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I raised my camera again, my only weapon, and snapped the shutter. The wraith flickered, its form distorting, but it didn't disappear. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its tattered clothes trailing behind it like smoke. The whispers grew louder, the air around me colder, thicker. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. The wraith didn't stop. It came closer and closer until it stood just feet away from me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Its face, a swirling mass of darkness, hovered inches from mine. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke, "You can't leave." When I woke up, I was lying on the riverbank, soaked to the bone. The wraith was gone, but the memory of its voice lingered in my mind, an echo that refused to fade. I don't know how I made it back to the trailhead. I don't remember the walk, the drive, or even packing up my gear. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never go back to Red River Gorge. Some places weren't meant to be explored. I bought the trailer last spring secondhand from a guy who was moving to Florida. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. That trailer was supposed to be my sanctuary. After the stress of the divorce and losing my job, I needed a break from everything. The thought of spending a few nights by myself, parked somewhere quiet, far from the chaos of my life, sounded like exactly what I needed. So, I headed to a place that had been calling to me ever since I'd heard about it. Lake Lanier. People talked about the lake in hushed tones around the campfire when I was younger. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed that entire towns had been drowned when they flooded the valley to create the lake in the 50s, cemeteries included. The dead, they said, were still down there, restless, under the water. I never paid much attention to the stories. Superstitious nonsense, I thought. But after everything I'd been through lately, the idea of driving to the lake and parking my trailer on a secluded shore was more appealing than ever. A fresh start, even if just for a few days. I found a spot at the edge of a small, isolated cove, far from any of the designated campgrounds or busy boat ramps. Just the quiet lap of water against the shore and the trees standing tall and silent. It was perfect, peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. I parked the trailer and set up camp, watching as the late afternoon sun shimmered on the surface of the lake. That first evening, I cracked open a beer and settled into my lawn chair facing the water. The silence was deep and soothing, almost too quiet. I could barely hear the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, birds singing, frogs croaking, just the faintest trickle of the water lapping against the shore. At first, it was comforting. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. But then, as dusk fell, the air started to feel heavy, as if something unseen had slipped into the space around me. I ignored it. Just nerves, I thought. I was stressed, burned out, and needed to relax. But even as the sun slipped below the horizon and the lake turned dark and still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the first night, I heard the sound. A soft splash, like someone wading through the shallows right outside my trailer. It was nearly midnight, and the fire had long since died out. I was tucked inside the trailer, half asleep, when I heard it again. Splash, then silence. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Probably a fish, I told myself, or some animal come down for a drink. But it wasn't. The splash came again, and this time it was louder, more deliberate, as if someone was walking through the water slowly. I crept to the window and peeked out, my breath catching in my throat. The moon was bright enough to light the water, and for a second I swore I saw a shape, something dark, standing in the shallows just a few feet from shore. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, like a person, but the figure was strange. Its head was too low, like it was hunched over, and its limbs looked wrong. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I stood frozen, heart racing, as I stared out at the still water. Nothing. Just the calm surface of the lake, as if nothing had been there at all. I didn't sleep much after that, tossing and turning, convinced it was just my imagination. I'd been through a lot lately. It was bound to mess with my head. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent the day fishing. Even though I didn't catch much, I kept telling myself I was just tired, that the isolation was getting to me. But then, when I walked back to the trailer in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. Footprints, small barefoot prints in the mud, leading from the water's edge up toward my trailer. They were small, like a child's. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they were my own tracks from earlier. But I hadn't been barefoot, and they didn't look right. They crisscrossed each other, as if someone had wandered back and forth around and around before disappearing into the trees. I crouched down, running my fingers over the prints, a chill creeping up my spine. There was no one else out here, no one but me. I looked up at the lake, at the still, murky water. It seemed darker than before, as if the light couldn't quite reach beneath the surface. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light. Maybe an animal had left the prints, or maybe someone else had camped here before I arrived. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, the footsteps returned. I had just turned off the lights and settled into bed when I heard it. The soft, wet squelch of footsteps moving slowly around the trailer. My heart began to race. I grabbed the flashlight and the small hunting knife I had brought with me, inching toward the door. The footsteps stopped, just outside. I flicked on the light and threw open the door, shining the beam of the flashlight out into the night. Nothing. Just the trees, the water, and the faint rustle of wind. But I knew I'd heard it. I wasn't imagining things. I'd heard footsteps circling the trailer, bare footsteps, like someone creeping through the mud. I locked the door and stayed up for hours, listening, but there was nothing else that night, just silence. By the next morning, my nerves were shot. I drove into town to grab supplies and shake off the tension. While waiting at a local diner for my food, I overheard some locals talking about the lake, about the old towns that had been submerged when the dam was built, and about the cemeteries that hadn't been fully relocated before the waters rose. "The dead don't rest easy out there," one of the older men said, his voice low. "You spend too much time by the lake at night, and you'll start hearing them. You'll hear them call your name, luring you down to the water." I felt the cold sweat trickle down my back. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, never had. But the way the man spoke, as if he'd seen something, felt something, unnerved me. I left the diner and drove back to the lake, more on edge than before. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the dread returned. It was stronger now, more insistent, like something in the air had shifted. I sat by the fire, staring at the lake, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The water, dark and still, seemed to be hiding something beneath its surface. And then I heard it, a voice, faint, almost indistinguishable from the breeze, but there, whispering my name. Rick? I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared out at the water, the fire crackling behind me, and the voice came again, soft and distant. Rick? It wasn't just the wind. It was real. I stood up, backing away from the shore, my pulse racing. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the water, my hands trembling. That's when I saw them. Figures. Dark, pale shapes just below the surface of the water. They were small, human-shaped, but their faces were twisted and distorted, like they were drowning but frozen in place. The water around them rippled slightly, as if they were trying to reach for me. But they stayed submerged, watching. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at the figures, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. I was losing it. I had to be. I turned and bolted back to the trailer, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife I'd grabbed. The footsteps came again that night, louder, more insistent, and the voice kept calling my name. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care how irrational it seemed or how crazy the story would sound when I got back home. I wasn't staying another night by that cursed lake. I packed up the trailer and tried to start the truck, dead. The battery was completely drained, even though I hadn't left anything running overnight. My hands shook as I tried again, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. It was as if the life had been sucked out of the vehicle. I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I tried to think. I could hike back to town, but it would take hours, and the thought of leaving the trailer and whatever safety it offered seemed like a death sentence. The water called to me, louder now, the whispers coming more frequently. They wanted me in the lake. I grabbed a set of tools from the back of the trailer, hoping to get the engine working again. As I worked, I felt eyes on me. I could sense them, the figures standing just at the water's edge, waiting. The temperature dropped, the air growing thick and cold as I frantically tried to get the battery to respond. Finally, after what felt like hours, the engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I jumped into the truck, threw it into gear, and peeled out of the campsite, the trailer jerking behind me. As I drove away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. They were there, standing at the edge of the lake, their pale, distorted faces watching me as I sped off into the night. I never went back to Lake Lanier. I haven't told anyone about what I saw or what happened, but even now, months later, when I lie awake at night in my own bed, far from the lake, I can still hear it, the faint sound of whispers calling my name.